Video games can be an absolute roller coaster of a ride when developers have a good understanding of how to control the pace of the experience. But this is easier said than done, and sometimes even the best of developers, intentionally or otherwise, overlook significant portions of the game that do nothing but artificially bloat the campaign with uninteresting activities. This is commonly referred to as padding, and we'll be talking about 15 terrible instances of the same in this feature. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain Repeat Missions. Metal Gear Solid 5 is a great game where you can spend dozens upon dozens of hours just tinkering around with the sandbox and its many systems, but there's little argument to the fact that the game is excessively padded out when it comes to the missions in Chapter 2. Many missions in the last chapter are rehashed missions from before, but players now have to complete those missions with brutal challenges tacked on, which can quickly turn into frustration as you try to satisfy the new clear conditions. Granted, these can be satisfying for some players, but given that the story ends randomly, these repeat missions stick out as a sore thumb. Those familiar with the game's turbulent development cycle might know why this otherwise great game has been padded out, but it doesn't really soften the blow of it regardless. Halo Combat Evolved: The Library. Despite being more than 2 decades old at this point, Halo Combat Evolved remains a masterclass in first-person shooter design. It's a supremely fun romp that's punctuated with all sorts of varied levels and unique scenarios. But the library is one part that even the most die-hard fans of the game hate with the utmost passion, and that's for good reason. It's a really lengthy level where players must fight through multiple floors to find the key item in the library. And while that might sound exciting, in theory it's anything but. Each room feels practically the same as the last, and the flood enemies that you face in this section quickly lose out their charm. It's such a dreaded level in an otherwise fantastic game that players have come up with all sorts of ingenious ways to quickly skip through the level by making specific jumps. Red Dead Redemption 2: GUARMA. Red Dead Redemption 2 features a really lengthy campaign in and of itself, and while the missions aren't always on the highest end of the intensity spectrum, Rockstar manages to keep them interesting through smart writing or fresh gameplay. But this doesn't apply to the 5th chapter of the game, which sees Vander Linde stranded on a remote island in GUARMA. It's an extremely linear section that just boils down to one shootout after the next. Sure, you do get an interesting change of location for these missions, but there's no incentive to explore the island because there's nothing of note to be found here. Furthermore, the missions in this segment don't really contribute to the overarching narrative in any meaningful way, so GUARMA just ends up feeling like a forced section of the story that's just there to pad out the narrative. God of War Ragnarok: Ironwood. Ragnarok is easily one of the most memorable experiences of recent years, and the developers do an excellent job of combining heart-pounding action with sincere story beats, but that combination doesn't apply to the Ironwood section of the game, which sees Atreus meeting up with Angrboda in the Forest of the Giants. It's a really slow section where you have to slowly make your way through the forest as you pluck different fruits for her pets, all while the two characters build their foundations of a strong friendship through their conversations. The writing is good enough in this section, but the gameplay that drives it feels like such a slog that you're bound to get bored on repeat playthroughs of this section. Super Mario Sunshine: Frustrating Shrine Sprites. Much like every other 3D entry in this esteemed platformer saga, Super Mario Sunshine is an excellent game that manages to carve out all sorts of varied obstacles and fun scenarios with one central mechanic, which is the water gun in this case. Collecting stars remains a fun affair for some time, but it can turn into a frustrating one once you reach the final boss. Fighting Bowser requires collecting a total of 70 star shrines, but the missions you need to complete aren't the most consistent in terms of quality. Several missions, like the pachinko machine, the leaf level, and the one where you must feed Yoshi the correct fruit to progress, can be an absolute pain to clear. Furthermore, many of these missions aren't even skippable since you need to collect the stars in a certain order for each level, which is directly at odds with the flexible level design of its predecessor, Super Mario 64. Mass Effect: The MAKO Sequences. Mass Effect is a fantastic space opera that's home to some great stories and memorable characters, but certain aspects of the original felt half-baked and borderline frustrating at times. I am of course talking about the MAKO sequences, which task you with exploring planets with this space vehicle. The controls feel really floaty in the original rendition of the game, which make movements and combat a total exercise in pain, as you keep replaying the same sections over and over again. These sequences can total up to a significant portion of the runtime, which makes it all the more worse. The Legendary Edition does make some changes to the experience with better controls and a boost option for the vehicle, and while it isn't completely fixed, we're thankful for the changes regardless. Batman Arkham Knight. The Batmobile sequences. Batman Arkham Knight is a great game with plenty of highs, but it's also a victim of excessive padding in its story department. The biggest offender in this case are the missions featuring the Batmobile, which generally follow a pretty rigid structure in that they start with a chase sequence and then they almost always end up with a combat encounter against the same kinds of enemies, which obviously require using the same tactics to defeat. It starts out fun, but as you keep doing the same things over and over again, it quickly transforms into a chore, and those wanting to explore the optional content are going to be even more frustrated with padding issues, particularly with Riddler trophies, which need to be collected before you get to battle the man himself. Mafia 3. Poor mission design. The first two Mafia games are known for their breakneck pacing when it comes to missions, but that sentiment doesn't transfer over to Mafia 3. Mafia 3's basic gameplay loop requires players to establish control over different businesses in the city, which involves doing the same handful of activities over and over again. Suffice to say, it starts to get really boring and repetitive after a time. Making matters worse is the fact that many of the main story missions take place in these same rehashed locations, which results in an excessively padded out experience. Thankfully, the story is good enough to make you want to keep going to the finish line. Shadow the Hedgehog. Repeat stages. Shadow the Hedgehog was a byproduct of Sega just blindly following gaming trends without understanding if the IP was compatible with those trends. And what we got was a game that failed to reach the mark both in terms of story and gameplay, the latter of which is excessively padded out with repetitive activities. You need to make a moral choice in every stage, which leads to a final boss for that specific story arc. There are 10 such boss fights in total, and you need to complete 8 out of the 10 boss fights to unlock the ending. This means playing the same levels over and over again with little in the name of variety, and this can easily turn into a frustrating affair that goes on for way longer than it needs to. Portal 2: The Fall. Portal 2 is a great game that still stands tall as one of the best puzzlers of the last couple of decades. But it isn't without its flaws. Most players would agree that the game suffers from some padding issues here and there. The biggest offender in this regard is Chapter 6, where you're thrust into a large expansive area, and the only thing you need to do is to figure out the walls that are portable in order to progress through the rubble. It feels a lot like filler stuff, since there's nothing fun or brain-tickling about this particular section. Sure, it might not sting as much the first time around, but it starts to get more aggravating in future replays, especially considering how short Portal 2's campaign is in the first place. Recore. Collecting cores. Recore might not have been as fun of a time as its pre-release hype made it out to be, but it definitely had some good points going for it. But sadly, those merits get buried under the tumultuous pacing of the experience. The entire gameplay loop of Recore is built around collecting cores of different types, and progress in the main story is restricted by the number of cores the player has before starting the story. This means that if you don't have the required number of collectibles for a story mission, you need to go back, explore, and collect the cores to play the next mission. It's a very cheap design trick that extends the game's length in an artificial sense, and we hope that developers abstain from using such tactics for their games. Metroid Prime Remastered. Artifact Hunt. Nintendo surprised us gamers by shadow-dropping a worthy remaster of Metroid Prime on Switch, and while the game still remains a compelling adventure all these years later, it is subject to some nonsensical padding that feels really aggravating according to modern standards. To gain access to the final area of the game, you need to collect all artifacts that are spread across the planet. Many of these artifacts can't be reached until you gain certain endgame abilities, so it's just not possible to keep collecting these objects as you run through the levels. Therefore, you have no option but to keep backtracking to previously explored areas just before the finale, which can really sour the experience for newcomers to the franchise. Super Ghouls and Ghosts, the second run. The Ghouls and Ghosts series is home to some of the most brutal platforming games of the NES and SNES era, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts is no exception to that rule. Once you manage to reach the final boss and beat him the first time around, you are greeted with a message that asks you to beat the game once again to get the true ending. Of course, those familiar with this series might know that this was coming, but that doesn't change the fact that this is a rather cheap way to bloat the game's length. Grand Theft Auto V Filler Missions. Grand Theft Auto V has cemented itself as one of the most popular games of all time, and for good reason. The wide-open playground of Los Santos allows players to carve out their own fun in any way imaginable. But that freedom is directly at odds with the rather awkward design of certain story missions. I'm talking about missions like scouting the port, where you have to meticulously carry crates around the port while disguised as a cargo worker, or pulling favors, where you have to tow a car from one place to another. These missions might not stick out all that much to you in your first playthrough, but they really start to become major nuisances on revisits. Sleeping Dogs. Driving missions. Much like Grand Theft Auto V that we discussed before, Sleeping Dogs also finds itself guilty of shoddy mission design that can really hamper the overall quality of the experience. While there's no shortage of great missions in Sleeping Dogs, there's also no shortage of missions like Bride-to-Be and Amanda, which basically boil down to driving people from one place to another, while engaging in weird filler activities like sightseeing or performing karaoke. These missions wouldn't be that much of a problem if that stuff was delegated to optional quests, but as it stands, they can certainly become a nuisance to the pacing of the main story. And that brings us to the end of the video. A quick request, we upload new videos every single day, and if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing. It really helps us out. Also, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon so that you can receive daily video updates. Thanks for watching.